All right, you joyously miserable accursed. After a week off of the curse of politics, a holiday week for me, spent frolicking in the mineral-rich waters of a hot spring in BC where I may or may not have indulged in a tranquility pedicure. We are back here at the Curse of Politics. Scott, how is it that we've known each other for like almost 40 years and have never gone hot springing together?
I don't know. It is remarkable because it's a constant pastime of mine. I am always massaging myself with essential and ancient minerals. And I mean, which, is exactly how I maintain this this glass-like face of mine. I don't like, from having, tried to force me to go to a spa once. I don't like to be involved in things where I'm partially disrobed with people I know casually. Like I'm a small town Protestant. I'm like, if I'm taking my clothes off, we're going to the bank. Okay. Like it's going, so I don't like any of that. I'm not sitting around with you in a pool of water.
I've known you for a long time, and I think what you said is not precisely accurate, but I'll just leave it at that. We're joined by Melanie Paradis today. Hello, Melanie. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Melanie, have you ever felt the healing waters of the hot springs?
I have.
Yes? Did they help your rheumatism?
They're definitely healing. I think, and there's lots of them across Canada. It's one of our great natural resources.
Hey, have both you guys been in the Dead Sea with like that crazy buoyancy and stuff?
No, I've not. And that's definitely on my list of things to do, though.
Yeah. There's also a place like that by Watrous, Saskatchewan, if you want to go there instead of the Dead Sea.
Really? Like a super high salinized...
yeah, there is. And the Dead Sea is disappearing, by the way. The last time I was there, it was more of a dead pond.
Really? Okay. I haven't been there in quite a while.
Travel seems so complicated these days. Why bother leaving the country?
Exactly. Melanie's a friend of Air Quotes Media. Having guested with us back in March on the Herle, she's been on the front lines of conservative campaigning for a few years now, serving as Deputy Campaign Communications Manager for Aaron O'Toole's 2020 leadership bid. Later, she served as Director of Strategic Communications for Mr. O'Toole and was his principal speechwriter. She also advised Doug Ford on media and comms during the 2018 election. I'll stop joking about that. Here's the rundown today. We'll do a piece on the Patrick Brown situation and writ larger the Conservative Party leadership race. Then it is the gathering of premiers in Victoria and the gathering health crisis. Our cursed clipping this week is Heather Schofield's piece in The Star about how our economy is empirically on fire but doesn't feel like it. We'll build on that. And finally, we'll get Gordon Pinson in here to herald our hey yous. Melanie, Scott, and I welcome you to The Curse. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
So, I've been away. What did I miss? Anything we should talk about today?
Probably not. Yeah, no big deal.
No big deal. All right, well, I did notice that the Calgary Stampede is on. And politicians are basking in the reflected glow of pancake griddles all over the place. I saw Poilievre on a horse. I read that Trudeau was mobbed. I saw Jason Kenney hanging out with Kevin Costner. I saw Jean Charest in a blue blazer and white shirt. Melanie, does anything happen at the Stampede that matters politically?
It's certainly locally. I'm not sure that it matters to the average person like outside of Alberta, but it's been really interesting to see the reaction that people have been having to various politicians. I think that the positive feedback that Justin Trudeau received was certainly notable to me. I understand that it was a Liberal event that he was at, but regardless, it's definitely a marked contrast to what we've seen in terms of like the convoy flags and the anti-Trudeau rhetoric. And I think that it should be a warning shot for Conservatives to see some positive in the middle of the Conservative heartland. For him to be getting some good news is it's a bit scary for me.
Well, it was, it was a Liberal event, obviously, and Scott, we've been to many, many, many of these things. But what I would say about it, for those that are dismissing it as a Liberal event in the middle of the Calgary Stampede, it was obviously well enough attended, and the reaction was sufficiently positive that a number of different media all got the same impression from it, that it was surprisingly strong and enthusiastic for him. Right, Scott?
Yeah, because we've all been sucking on the fire hose of Twitter for the past 6 months, thinking that the only dialogue politically in the country is, how terrifying Pierre Poilievre is, which, I'm responsible for contributing to constantly because I don't think the people are taking this guy seriously enough, even as they tell me, oh, no, we're taking him seriously. Don't be condescending to me.
My guess is that Melanie takes him seriously.
I would suspect she does. It's funny. I find that a lot. I find a lot of conservative friends take him very seriously. Conservative friends who are big-time supporters take him super seriously. And conservative, certainly major league conservative supporters who are not fans of his take him wicked seriously. And I think that's going to spread to the rest of us. But look, what I took away from that is two quick. First of all, I think it's awesome that the Calgary Stampede has become like this thing that you must go to politically, right? You must go and bow at the altar, and
it's like the plowing match in Ontario.
Absolutely, man. The international plowing match. I'll tell you what, in grade 10, I worked the international plowing match. I got to bomb around on a trike because they still had trikes back then. They hadn't been deemed illegally unsafe, and bombing around in a field north of Stirling, Ontario, telling people, okay, park your car over there, and you in the pickup. Fuck off. It was awesome. But, the Stampede has become something that you've got to go to politically. And I think it's fun to watch how that plays. The Trudeau thing, I would just say this, and I know there's lots of other events that occurred that probably merit more discussion, but two things about it. One, it reminds us that Calgary is a politically pluralistic place. And people, I think, forget that, particularly wanks like me who live in central Canada, forget that. And there's a lot of political fibers in that in that particular blanket out there in the city of Calgary at minimum, and also the city of Edmonton, obviously. And secondly, don't forget, Trudeau's a celebrity, and people say that with derision, but it was also something that scared the living bejesus and changed the course of political history in 2015. And he remains a celebrity for all the dents and bruises, for all the backsteps, for all the incumbency, all of that. He remains a celebrity, and every once in a while, we get a glimpse of an event like this where you go, holy smokes, guys, he brings his own gravitational field. And that's something that, people who would like to replace him if he should go, can't just summon like with a snap of the fingers and assume is there. And that's why I say Trudeau has to stay in office and get better and defeat Poilievre.
We need a better version of what we've got. Melanie, we've been talking about Trudeau, but there were conservatives at the Stampede as well.
I think there might have been two. There were many conservatives there. Yes, yeah. I mean,
more conservatives than liberals. Let's say there's more conservatives than liberals generally at the Stampede, but
yes.
But there were Poilievre had a huge event and a large reaction, and a lot of media wrote, "Oh my God, Alberta conservatives are absolutely in love with Pierre Poilievre." Jean Charest apparently got at least a smattering of boos when he began his remarks at an event, which his team proudly said was turned into applause by the end. But that doesn't feel like votes to me. That feels like politeness.
Well, I think, by the end, what's important here is these were 5-minute speeches. And it was a Conservative Party event, and each of the candidates had the opportunity to provide remarks for a couple minutes to the crowd. I believe that Charest followed Pierre, which would have been a tough act to follow, certainly with that crowd. And you're right. The account that I've heard was that it started off with a smattering of boos, but by the end of it, a few minutes later, he had turned everyone, and the crowd was on their feet, apparently. Now, I don't know if they were sitting to begin with, to be fair. So
it sounds kind of Hollywood. Women were ripping their bodices off. Yes. It was startling, the transformation that he wove through the crowd.
But there has been a couple days of positive news coverage for him in Alberta related to his Alberta Accord, or whatever the policy is called, where he's clearly trying to make inroads there, which is a positive thing. Okay. I don't know what else I can say, right? Like things have been, the past 2 weeks in the Conservative leadership race have obviously been crazy. I feel like I could have said that up until this point about any week as well, but the departure, the disqualification of Patrick Brown and his notable absence from the Calgary Stampede has created, it's such an elephant now that it's amazing we're even talking about what the speeches at Stampede were, because this is consumed. We're stuck in a vortex of Patrick Brown, which is not a great place to be.
I think the only way that Patrick Brown would look good in a cowboy hat is if he was walking next to an astronaut. I think we got to go full Pixar for that guy.
Look at what we missed out on by not having him there.
Maybe.
So let's go to it. You brought it up. So, I didn't want to go too conservative things in a row. Just, out of fairness to you,
I can handle
on
it.
this show. You can handle it. All right, let's go right at it. So Brown is out. This is not new news, but it's new news to the curse of politics because we weren't on last week. So Brown is out. Some are questioning the legitimacy of that decision, but it feels like a done deal to me. It doesn't feel like there's any going back. It doesn't feel like Brown will be, he's on the ballot, but it doesn't sound like he'll be actually in the race for the rest of the duration. It changes the math of the thing to my mind in a way that would seem fatal to Charest's candidacy, in addition to Brown's. Mel, what is the take inside the party on this decision and what's going on in the aftermath?
So I think more than anything, the frustration around wasn't the decision itself. It's the sort of spin out effects of where we are right now. For the past week, we should have been talking about Brenda Lucki and the potential interference that the Prime Minister's office, the Minister's office may have had on a criminal investigation into the worst mass killing in Canadian history. And instead, we're talking about Debbie Jardin and whether or not she was paid by, a friend of Patrick Brown. And we're just so in the weeds on this kind of Canadiana true crime political edition that we aren't able to focus on things that I think actually matter to everyday Canadians. And that's pretty frustrating. And every day that we're talking about this is a day that the Liberals are winning, which should upset all Conservatives, frankly. That doesn't mean that the decision by Leoch was the wrong decision. Now, I have no idea what the legal arguments are going to be here about that. But
is that Ian Brody's alien name? Leoch?
Leoch. We greet you with the traditional handshake of our people.
Take me to Leoch. Yeah. The Leadership Election Organizing Committee for those playing the home game. That's what it stands for. Yeah, and so according to our rules, their decision is final. So,
Scott, before you jump in here, let me just say, Melanie, I'm looking at you and I'm saying that they cannot possibly have disqualified this guy because a company was going to pay this person to work on his campaign. That is a minor offense. That is not a disqualifying offense. I assume that there's a lot more stuff behind there. I assume, for instance, that they know for a fact that he's paying for 100,000 memberships or 150,000 memberships, and it cannot be this one whistleblower.
So
Can't tell me it isn't.
Apparently, the allegations around paid memberships and reimbursements for memberships and whatnot, the financial stuff, those allegations were brought forward previously, and my understanding is that they were dealt with, that the campaign was sanctioned, that those names were removed from the list, which would be the appropriate way of dealing with that problem. This was a separate issue, and apparently, like we're supposed to, be led to understand or to believe that this is the reason why he was disqualified. And I'm also a bit perplexed by this, and I continue to push for more. Like, there's got to be more. What is it that those text messages say exactly? Is it really just this? Now, I don't want to diminish this because it is a violation of Canada Election Act, and we shouldn't be breaking the law during our elections. Like, that's pretty simple. So I do support the challenge.
It's a little late in the day to come to that conclusion, Melanie. I have some thoughts from 2006 for you, but anyway.
No kidding. I'm with you guys, I guess, in the broad sense that I think that there is a wider context, some of which we do know, maybe possibly some of which we do not, that took Leoch to the place where it said, this is the decision we have to take. Because I assume, people like to spin conspiracy theories and all this stuff. And goodness knows, I get up every single day and I lace up my Vans and I say, it is time to commit today to stopping Pierre Poilievre. I think this guy is a fundamental existential threat to the collective institutions that I treasure, and so I want him stopped. But I do not for one tinkering damn of a minute believe that Leoc was acting in concert with the campaign, that they were so scared by him they need to rig the race in favor of Pierre. I think it's all such self-serving horseshit that's just transparently and risibly untrue. Self-serving coming from the Patrick Brown campaign. And so I don't know what lurks beneath the waters, but I know that Leoc had no interest in making this decision.
He was going to quit and run for mayor anyway. Like
he was quitting anyway. Absolutely. Pierre's crushing. He was going to quit. Brown was going to quit anyway. Leoc does not want this. This brings a whole set of who wants whiff of scandal and stamp of disqualification and potential, I don't know if it's illegality, at least it's a breach of law in terms of elections law onto their race. They don't want that. It puts mud all over their trousers. So they didn't want to do this. They obviously felt that they had no choice but to do it, and probably because there is additional context. But
come on, they think he's got ethical issues, and they didn't want him to run in the first place. I mean, if you are if you're in the Brown campaign, you have to be reading all these things that come out day after day, and there's a new one today, a little bit of backstory, and say they wanted to disqualify him from the very beginning. Like, they didn't think he should be a candidate for this race. And they've been looking for a way to do it all the way along.
Well, hey, Patrick Brown, ask yourself fucking why. Why? Why is it that people don't want to stand with you? Why is it that 2 deputy mayors in the city of Brampton come out a day after this federal move and say, here's a bunch of contracting questions? Why is it that there were 4 violations of ethics in the Ontario legislature and you were booted from your position as leader by those who know you closest, your caucus colleagues and your own staff, right? Why? Why does this stink cloud follow you around? Why don't they never wanted me in the race? When he goes on TV and says, well, they never wanted me in the race in the first place, I say, well, why? Why is it? It's because there's an odor around you, and I don't think it's coming from the field next door. It's coming from you. And so, that's who this guy is. And I have zero sympathy for him.
That he seems to be kind of Teflon. His supporters are diehard, and they've heard all these things for years. Everything that you've just pointed out, they've heard it for years, and they don't seem to care.
Well, he's going to test that, because he's going to try to reach back into the deck and play the exact same hand that he did last time. He's going to declare for mayor. I mean, yesterday, CP24 here in 24 is running a banner all day long saying, he's consulting with his family as to what his next political moves are. Yeah, I know how this story goes. That's the first one. So, I'm going to continue the fight, but I recognize the inevitable. The party won't have me, so I have to consider my next options. Within a week, he'll be declaring that he is, in fact, the candidate for mayor of the city of Brampton. And then I hope the people of Brampton give it to him right in the kisser, because we don't need this guy in public life. He's not. I mean, no. Federally, provincially,
Melanie, you made a face when I did my introduction, and I said that it changes the math in a way that is fatal to Charest's candidacy. Walk me through how that isn't true. I actually didn't understand how Charest could possibly win with Brown as a candidate, because Charest's behind Brown. I don't know how he gets ahead of him on a ranked ballot. But without him, I presume the Brown votes don't show up. Is that not right?
I think that a lot won't. However, even late last night, the director of communications, Chisholm, for Patrick Brown was tweeting about a meeting that they were having with their organizers, where they were, I guess, pumping them up and saying, like, guys, you got to get everyone, all these memberships that you sold, you got to get them to vote for Charest now. Mm-hmm. He's the only hope. So they're now directly telling their team that's their marching orders. Now, some of the regional organizers have.
It's one step removed, right? Like, it's one step removed. So it's much harder to pull you get a crappy turnout of mass membership sales to begin with. You always get a terrible turnout of those people. And now it's one step removed. They're not voting for the person who signed them. They're voting for somebody who would sign them up for somebody else.
And just to that point, though, Melanie, on your mention of what Brown's campaign, talking about how they're going to pull the vote and direct it toward Charest, I just wanted to also just interrupt and mention that I, next Tuesday, am chairing a meeting of the Fuck Zaccardelli Committee. And I hope there'll be a robust turnout, because we're right on the edge, folks, of finally getting justice.
All right. So look, the math is different. You're right. And I think what's in the context that I'm coming from, and I have this entire race, and it's why I've been skeptical of a first ballot victory for anyone, even though clearly Pierre is doing really, really well. Clearly he is the front runner. There's no question about that. But I remain skeptical of a first ballot victory because the way that the points break down is just, it's so hard to accomplish that. And if we look at the sales numbers, so let's say we have 675,000 members, 450,000 of them are in just 100 ridings of the 338. So that means that those are really, really heavy ridings with a lot of people. That kind of spreads out the points. There's of those 450, there's 100,000 in just 20 ridings. And that's largely like out west. So this is not a super efficient vote for anyone. This is these are the general numbers. These aren't just like Pierre's numbers or Sheray's numbers or whatever. Quebec is really interesting. We sold 56,000. When I say we, I mean the party generally sold 56,000 memberships in Quebec, which is wild. We've never done anything like that before. Pierre's campaign at membership cutoff publicly released their numbers and said that they sold 25,000 memberships in Quebec and they released that not knowing what the total was. So that's about 25 into 56, that's 40%. And most of the points in Quebec is like 7,000. I don't know. I'm getting into the weeds here in terms of the math, but there's a hell of a lot of points in Quebec. There's more points in Quebec than there is in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba combined. So if you have a strong showing there, if Charest is going to get 60% to Pierre's 40 in Quebec, then he's actually in contention. Like there's a race that's still going to be on there. And I think the other thing that's important to understand about
we know, while we're on Quebec, do we know how many ridings in Quebec will actually be sending 100 votes?
At this point, with 650,000 memberships, every riding's got over 100.
Okay.
All of them.
All right.
Now, but I guess, turnout is important too, because it's not just do you have 100 points in that riding? It's do you have 100 points worth of votes in the riding? So, if there are 100 members, but only 65 of them vote, then that's a 65-point riding. And this is important because so while I learned a lot from the 2017 leadership and the 2020 leadership, in 2018, I worked on Christine Elliott's leadership provincially in Ontario. And I learned so much from that loss. Christine won the popular vote and she won the most ridings. But 2 of those ridings, I think it was 2, had fewer than 100 points. And that is how she lost, was purely on points. That race was so insanely close and it broke down on points. And so that's why I'm just like that. Those experiences are burned into my soul and I'm going to be a skeptic until the results actually come in. That doesn't mean that I don't think that Pierre will win or should win or any of those things. It's just, I'm going to be crotchety the whole time.
Crotchety. So we've been talking here for, about 9 weeks now about a single topic, a hella big, as the kids say, planet-sustaining topic, ESG, environmental, social, and governance. More specifically, the actions our presenting sponsor TELUS have been taking to use their world-leading technology and their compassion to drive social change and a successful bottom line. Capitalism with a conscience. The two are not mutually exclusive if you work hard enough to get it right. And that's the thing about businesses really living up to ESG commitments. It ain't easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is, eh? Many just greenwash, and many others refuse to balance the perceived siren's call of short-term profitability with meeting ESG responsibilities. Last week, I mentioned that PwC has just released a report on the topic. It covers a lot of ground, including how our government can accelerate the standardization and regulation of ESG reporting in the private sector. It also lays out the private sector benefits that, frankly, TELUS has seen clearly for years now. That embedding ESG into strategy and operations and then reporting it all transparently is doing the right thing, the good thing, and it builds trust across all your stakeholder groups, which in turn builds value. Superior long-term return on investment, improved employee satisfaction, ethical supply chains, and better outcomes for the communities they operate in. And when all of it works in a virtuous circle, public and private sectors feeding each other's success on ESG, Canada can keep pace with UK, Germany, and the US and accelerate progress on our own policies, like the 2030 emission reduction plan. Told you it was a big topic, hurly-burlyites. We end, as we like to do in my world, with the data. For further evidence of TELUS's commitments and progress, go to their sustainability and ESG report at telus.com/sustainability. All right, let's move on. Heather Schofield from the Toronto Star, and I believe we have cited her here before for her excellent writing on the economy and politics, had another really good piece this past week called "Canada's Economy is on Fire. Why doesn't it feel that way?" I don't really need to read much because the headline sums it up. But, she starts off by saying that the Royal Bank of Canada has forecast a recession, higher unemployment and a shrinking economy, but the labor market doesn't look that way statistically. Lowest unemployment rate, highest working factors. Economists say the economy is growing. But she says, collectively, we really aren't feeling like the economy is on fire. Far from it. And that's an intractable problem for any policymaker whose job it is to make sure we don't succumb to hard times. We are in a moment of confusing currents in the economy where one wave of overheated growth and ensuing inflation is crashing into an oncoming wave of higher interest rates, global slowdown, and uncertainty. Consumer confidence indicators tell us we are an anxious mess. Scott, it sounds like, something that we've been saying about the federal government's leadership on the economy for a little while now.
Yeah, and I think this column, and I love Heather's writing. I love her column. I love the interplay between politics and the economy that her column features. It really bullseyes those two currents and finds awesome insights consistently. I think this column is dangerous for the federal government, for the incumbent federal government. It's dangerous because they can read it and find in it affirmation that things are better than they seem. And then they can decide that that is their communication strategy. And there is real, I just yesterday, flipping borders, I was listening to a Democratic strategist on a podcast who was railing on about why isn't Biden out there talking about the strength of the economy. And, you and I know from the 2004 election campaign, David, when the economy is doing well, you can't claim credit for it politically because no one's willing to give you credit for it. They just think you're crowing. When the economy doesn't feel or is not doing well, the last thing people want to be told is, actually, it's doing quite well. That just angers people. Telling people something that they don't believe, forcing a counterintuitive truth that also happens to benefit you politically is a dangerous political play, a dangerous communication strategy.
I have a recent survey done by the Gandalf Group that says that 50% of Canadians feel they're worse off today than they were 2 years ago.
Right. So you can't go out there and say, actually, the labor market is doing this. And if you take a look at these currents, this is what's positive. And then already there are signs that inflation is abating. And therefore, that means that, we're going to get out. I just think you're extremely dangerous. I think you have to be talking about what you're doing to make it better. Not trying to persuade people, that the barbecue briquettes they're trying to light actually catch fire perfectly and everything's great. You have to tell people what I'm doing to get you a better match and more lighter fluid. That's you got to be in that zone. The other quick takeaway I have is that I think part of the snapshot that Heather is taking is fluid. And so the challenge, I think, is that some of the positives are going to get pushed out. I mean, we're looking at perversities right now, post-pandemic, and we're in a moment of crossover, I think. So as higher interest rates take their bite, the unemployment, the employment figures are going to start to change. Certainly the growth figures are going to start to change. I mean, as you've said before, David, we're putting chemo into the circulatory system of the Canadian economy because we have to. But the hair will fall out. And just because it's still blonde and curly right now, it doesn't mean that all is well.
There's a Leger poll out this morning that supports this too, saying that 80% of Canadians believe that prices are going to keep going up, and which is changing their spending patterns because they're starting to trying to save a bit more, and they're worrying about dark times ahead. And 59% of Canadians think that we're already in a recession. So these, it doesn't bode well. Also, I just want to say that these are incredibly complex economic issues. There's a lot of reasons why we're in this situation, and there are a lot of complicated things that need to be done to get us out of it. None of it is easy to communicate about. And I totally agree with Scott that I think the focus of both the government and, I would argue, the opposition needs to be on what are we going to do to make things better and easier for your day-to-day life, and speak to Canadians where they are right now.
Well, how would you do that, Melanie? Like, how would you go about talking to people about a bad economy?
It's a great question.
I mean, I'll give you a second, because Chrystia Freeland tried this. It's the last thing I saw before I checked out for vacation. She tried this. I know it doesn't feel good to you, but the reality is we're this in the G7, and we're this in the OECD, and we're that in the this, and we're that this in the that. And, even to me, it didn't feel good.
Yeah.
So, I find those kind of international comparisons don't make people feel better about their own personal circumstances, and there isn't much of a way to make people feel better about their own personal circumstances. And I'll add this log on the fire, which is that I'm not sure this is all about the economy either. I think Canadians are in a really shitty mood. I think the country's in a bad mood. I think people are frustrated, and they've come out of COVID in a black place.
I think that's part of it. Certainly, I think there's a mental health crisis in Canada right now that COVID has only exacerbated. There's certainly an element of that at play. But again, there's so many layers to this. There are so many different problems that to eat the elephant, we kind of have to break this down one piece at a time. So let's just talk about housing right now, because I think that's obviously a pain point for a lot of Canadians, but especially with interest rates going up, it's causing, I think, the greatest amount of anxiety. And one of the risks of communicating with Canadians about this is that you are actually going to exacerbate that anxiety if you're honest with them. So if you bought a home for $800,000, which is now the average price of a home in Canada, you have a 25-year mortgage at 2%. Let's say that you bought this last year and you got 2%. Your monthly payment is probably $3,000. When you reopen at 5%, your monthly payment is $4,000. And if it goes up to 7%, we're talking about $5,000. Who has an extra $2,000 a month to pay their mortgage? People do not. Most Canadians don't even have an extra $200 a month. And so we're seeing the cost of groceries, of gas, of all of these things going up. And there's just nothing by way of remedy being communicated to them. So they're getting afraid, and it's actually their fear is exacerbating the problem.
Yeah. Mike Murphy in the States says the U.S. midterms are going to be about gas and groceries. So recently, our sponsor CN devoted a day to celebrating safety. Workplace safety is an industry grail. We've all seen those signs in factories and on industrial sites tallying accident-free days. But when your job is deploying some of the most powerful machines on Earth to move millions of tons of cargo over thousands of miles every year, safety becomes a baked-in prime directive. CN is responsible not just for keeping its 20,000-plus railroaders safe, but also all the cities, towns, and villages along its North American network. Anyway, CN's safety celebration honored several employees who've gone the extra mile of ingenuity, so to speak, like the track inspectors in Manitoba who began carrying cans of spray dye, using it to expose rail defects that might have caused a serious accident had they gone unnoticed. The railway also spotlighted 42 individuals who managed to serve 35 years or more without a single injury. One of them was a fellow named Tim Stambaugh, who started with CN in Alberta in 1976. He remembered that back then, safety was something you learned about on the fly. You figured it out for yourself. He's still a railroader, and when he collected his award, he said CN's modern training programs and safety standards now set the standard in the industry and are widely copied. After 46 years in railroading, Tim had two signal pieces of wisdom. First, he said, think about what you're doing. Impulse can be deadly. Second, he said, if we keep improving, luck will have no place on the railroad. Luck has no place on the railroad. How's that for an excellent slogan? Congratulations to them all.
Yeah, makes sense. Like, I actually think there are things you can do. I think there is a better way to talk about the economy that is advantageous to an incumbent government, and it's always really tough when you're in the incumbent government and things are taking a tough turn. I think, first of all, but it will require a little bit of policy change, and it will require a huge strategic and tone change. I won't even go to where you went last pod, David, about Chrystia Freeland. I mean, I think there have been 3 signature moves to the mic in the past month on these issues by her, and I think every single one of them have been terrible. Like, literally, like, I can't pretend. I'd like to try to sugarcoat it. I'd like to pretend that it's better than that, but I think they've all been terrible. The speech, then the whole, it's okay to be mad at me, and then finally the speech, the remarks you were talking about. But I think first you start off by obviously demonstrating that you understand the anxiety that people are going through. Second, you got to articulate that you've got a handful of strategies that are based around, 1, we're going to provide you with some relief in the near term, and 2, we're fixing the problem for the medium term. And that's a variation on some of the policy stuff you're doing now, but you probably need to throw a couple of relief logs on the fire. I think you really do. And then finally, I think the one thing that they're not taking advantage of is to say, and let's understand it. Like, there's only a few roads out of this, and here's what would be the wrong road. And then you line up on your opponents and you pound the living shit out of them. And don't make it partisan in the sense that you don't like make it all about the conservatives say, but just go like, here are some of the arguments that are being made about what else we should do. And this is why those things are wrong. And start to build it as a choice. There's a choice here. As to how we get through this thing, what we're guided by, where it will take us. Start building the storyline around that choice, because it's easy when you're not in government to say everything's fucked up and have people nod their head. But what they say they would do instead is usually pretty lame. So if you're in government, you got to build that as a choice. It can't just be you taking punches for what you're not doing. Make it the choice as to what you're doing in contrast to what others would.
Well, can I build this with your general refrain about getting on Poilievre early? I mean, my view is that it's highly likely that if the circumstances in the next election were to be similar economically to what they are now, that Poilievre wins the economic debate unless something changes the way you're talking about. And I don't think you can win an election and lose the economic argument. I mean, we had the luxury in 2004 of changing the channel to something other than corruption and non-economic, because we owned the economy so solidly in 2004. But that isn't the case. That isn't the case here. And so I don't think the government cannot engage in the fight. And the fight that it seems to me they should be engaging in now, while it's still relatively fresh in people's minds, is that the entire Poilievre economic plan is based on not having had the CERB. Yeah. The fundamental criticism of Poilievre, of the federal government, is its overspending, therefore creating high inflation. The spending was on the CERB. The rest of it is nickels and dimes relative to inflation. And so surely now is the time to be cementing in voters' heads that he would not have had their back.
And I go right at small business. Right. I would take the CERB and always use it as a springboard, like take that argument about the past, but use it as springboard in the future. So if that's what he was going to tolerate, right, in slavish commitment to his view of because he's still like the wingtip kid going to grade 11 with a briefcase talking about Margaret Thatcher. If that's the prescription he would have had through CERB, because it violated his notion of a free market economy, freedom to fucking die at the side of the ditch, right? Then what does that mean he'll do as we struggle through, if we do end up in a global recession? What does that mean? Where's he going to be for you on that? What's that? Who's going to get past this? Well, so I'm 100% with you. And I'll tell you one thing that sort of frosts my berry when I look. The Prime Minister's been on a tour for 10 days. And he had that great event that we talked about at the Calgary Stampede. That's kind of like hold the mic, get cheers, all that kind of stuff. But you look at his schedule. Look at his itinerary. Look at the events that he's attending. It's your typical summer tour stuff. But a lot of it is, here's a climate technology that we're working on. Then it'll be like, let's have a meeting with Masai Ujiri to talk about guns and gangs. And they're all obviously worthy causes. But you know what is very rarely built around? An economic issue, a bread and butter cost of living issue. Like, it's just not a big part of the story that he's telling right now. And I assume that they've made the decision that they can't talk about it without increasing the problem or demand or forcing accountability on themselves. But I think that's a wrong call. I think you got to, this fight can't be ducked, so you got to win it.
Yeah, I think this tour is less embarrassing than the peace tour in 1983, but likely to be about as effective. Melanie, any last thoughts on this economic situation and whether the Liberals are hoist on their own petard here, or can they get out of this?
Well, I think there's always a way to get out of it. I mean, one of the answers is not to, fire the head of the Bank of Canada unless we're going to retrain him to be a carpenter. I don't think that there's actually that's not the answer that we need. I mean, we have a massive labor shortage. That's another element of this. It's not just that the government's been printing money and we need to stop that and it's causing inflation. Like, that's a problem too. Don't get me wrong. But we also have a insane labor shortage. We need to be encouraging every young person in this country to go into the skilled trades, like never mind your useless degree at a university that doesn't allow you to think independently anyway. Go learn how to be an electrician, and you'll have a job for the rest of your life, and you can use those skills anywhere, and your country really needs you to do exactly that. The other thing that I'll note is while we're in the throes of this Conservative leadership race, we're not being super effective as the opposition, unfortunately. And so the premiers have now formed basically the official opposition, and we're seeing them playing that role at the Council of Federation meeting this week, where they're talking about a whole host of issues where they need the federal government to take action. And one of those is certainly around Bill C-69, which the Conservatives have always called this the anti-pipeline bill, but which was a mistake because it's so much more than about pipelines. It's about the Highway 413 is going to be challenged by this. In Ontario, we just ran and won an election in part around the support for Highway 413, and that could be stopped by this environmental legislation. And then also the Ring of Fire and the need to get that built, that can be delayed by Bill C-69. So we've seen all of the provinces are now engaged in the court challenge and in pursuing this in support of Alberta and trying to get the federal government to change their position on it. If obviously, in my opinion, I think that the federal government should just say, you know what, we're not going to let the Supreme Court rule on this. We're just going to pull the legislation and make amendments so that it's more palatable and that it actually works for two reasons. One, Germany is coming to Canada in August. The German chancellor is coming to ask us for our LNG to start exporting it. The rest of the world is waiting on us to get our critical minerals out of the ground so that we can build the electric vehicles of the future and all this stuff. We can't do any of that with this legislation. So they really need to just pull it.
Well, politically, I'll take the opposite point of view. I'll sort of endorse the government's political strategy on this, which is I bet on voting day, whenever it is, that the only people in Canada who are voting on Bill C-69, if it's overturned, are people in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia, and they're voting against the Conservatives.
I mean, that's a cynical way of looking at things.
But correct in my view. I'm with you, Dave. I'm totally with you. You know what? Just on the premiers.
I shocked her with my cynicism.
Isn't
my God,
sad?
do you not listen to the show?
Yes, I do.
Have we not met?
I thought that big Saskatchewan heart that beats in your breast. I thought you were something you're not, David. So while
realistically, we need these projects to move forward, though, to not only for the economy and jobs and all of those things, but for the security of our resources in Canada and around the world. Canada has the opportunity to become the premier exporter of critical minerals, and we can't do that with this kind of legislation.
Well, I'm telling you, Melanie, and you know this to be true, that Bill C-69 is not the reason that the Ring of Fire is not being developed.
For the past decade, that you're right. Bill C-69 was not the reason why for the past decade it hasn't happened. Yes, there are a lot of other reasons why.
And the disappearance of Bill C-69 will not make the Ring of Fire happen. These are very complicated matters, and that's one.
It certainly exacerbates the problem, though.
Okay. The thing I'm paying attention to, I know I should be more concerned about critical minerals, Melanie, but I've got old politics in my bones, and
Aren't you just bathing in them, David? You were bathing.
What I see at the Premier's meetings is health transfers, demands for health transfers. No. It's a perennial demand, and sometimes it gets discounted as such, as a perennial demand, but it's a perennial demand for a reason. And that is that healthcare costs are rising constantly, and the federal contribution has not kept pace with the rising costs of healthcare, and it's eating provincial budgets. Anybody that's worked in a provincial government knows it's eating provincial budgets. In my view, not inappropriately, because it's a super important thing to do and do well, but nonetheless, they need more money. The feds seem to have been finding throughout COVID innovative ways of getting healthcare money to the provinces without increasing the transfer to them. Due largely, it seems, to concerns about accountability and the ways provinces are going to spend the money. All right, Scott, unless you tell me different, I'm going to say right here and now that the feds fold on the transfer sometime between now and the next election and increase the healthcare transfer to the provinces.
I think that's likely. I think that's likely because the hard politics of math, particularly after Legault is reelected with a smashing victory, and as we get closer to either the reality of an election or the anxiety of an election, because people start to say maybe this pact isn't going to keep us covered through such turbulent economic and political times. I think as all that happens, they'll probably fold. But a couple of things. One, you're right. Like you're dead right, David. The Premier's coming together to say we want no strings attached cash for health is like you and me asking for a rum and Coke. It happens twice a day, right? So this is just this. But what's different right now in this moment is that we've, of course, come through the pandemic, and our healthcare system, in addition to all those macro growing strains that you talked about in abstract terms, I think, we've also got, their voices are being compounded and amplified by, people working in the healthcare industry. You got doctors, physicians, you've got frontline workers, you've got hospital administrators, as far as the eye can see, on TV and on the radio saying, listen, right, people working in the system on the front lines are post-pandemic fleeing like folks from a burning building. And it's just, it really is, people are burned out and ground down. And so the demand for money is not going away. It's real. I don't think that the premiers have been very persuasive because they always end up in the lowest common denominator, which is the highest possible dollar demand. But, with no strings attached. But, the last thing I would say, David, is that our personal history in government points the way in both directions. One, in 1995, we partly built this problem because we cut what remaining strings were there with the creation of the combined CHT, right? And that's just a historical fact. So if you and I are going to lament about untethered funds, we have to acknowledge that was one of the prices that we paid in order to conquer the deficit, and we made those choices knowingly in 1995. But the corollary is that when we had a fistful of cash in 2004, as messy as those negotiations were, and they were fucking messy, that all-night argument at 24 Sussex Drive, wandering around in the grounds with premiers from all over the place, and Danny Williams and Ralph Klein going to the casino and all that, messy and all that. We got a deal that did establish 5 priorities, and there was some accountability, and lots of people will tell you there were all kinds of problems with it. But it's a template that could be repeated, I think, if the feds wanted to move now. But my guess is they'll just surrender to political realities, and all this, we're back to being fiscal hawks, like they were ever fiscal hawks talk, is just going to evaporate.
Yeah. And
Melanie, how do the Conservatives play in healthcare politics?
Well, Aaron O'Toole had long argued that we need to support the premiers in their call for increasing the health transfers. Certainly, I think that the premiers, again, they're forming the official opposition over the course of the summer. They really need to land the health crisis squarely on the doorstep of the prime minister. They need to, which isn't an easy thing to communicate about because most Canadians really do understand that health is provincial. The problem is the issues that we're having with our healthcare system are not just in one province or another. This isn't a mismanagement issue. It's in every province all across the country. The shortages are the cancer screening backlogs are outrageous. There's tens of thousands of family doctors that are retiring. There's nurses that are reporting a 94% burnout rate. They're like 50% of them are going to leave the profession in the next couple of years because the stress levels are outrageous and the things that are being expected of them. I read a story about a nurse that was being tracked down at the grocery store, and they were demanding that she come back into the hospital to work because they were so short-staffed. It's not sustainable at all. And every single Canadian has a story of a loved one who's waited in the ER for hours. Just a few weeks ago, my own father waited for 5 hours for a stroke screening. Like, that's insane. Thankfully he had not had a stroke, but if he had, waiting that long is dangerous. And what's interesting, I think this is going to require some really creative thinking. It's more than just money that's needed here. Like, money is absolutely part of the problem. We need money so that we can hire more nurses, so that we can, train up more doctors, all of those things we need money for. But there's also an opportunity in this post-COVID environment to start introducing innovative policies that will get people out of the emergency room who don't need to be there. And this is the moment where I talk about urinary tract infections on your podcast. I know the eyeballs were
okay.
Great.
You've got our attention. Yeah. What do I need to do?
Seriously, you're talking my language.
So just as one example of a simple fix, and we're going to need a lot of these. This isn't going to fix everything, but pre-pandemic, urinary tract infections was one of the top 5 reasons for ER visits in Canada. Top 5. Okay. So you're waiting in line right now at the emergency room because you're bleeding or something. There's 3 people ahead of you in line who need an antibiotic prescription, and that's why they're in the ER. It's ridiculous. In Manitoba and in New Brunswick, they gave the ability to pharmacists to prescribe the single-dose antibiotic that you take for an uncomplicated urinary tract infection. This is something that impacts 12 to 15% of Canadian women annually. That's 1.7 million people who go to the emergency room for no reason. And they could be served outside of the healthcare system in a pharmacy instead. It'd still be covered under our provincial insurance, all of that stuff. This is one very simple fix. We've already seen it, like I said, in Manitoba and New Brunswick. Why don't we do that across the country? There are probably dozens of simple things like that we could implement that would actually have a significant impact. So I think it's a combination of things. It's absolutely, we need a hell of a lot more money from the federal government to fix the massive backlogs and the staffing crisis that we have, but we also need some real innovative thinking.
But you wouldn't suggest the federal government be driving that thinking, would you?
I mean, maybe. Why not? Why not?
Because the provinces won't want them to. The provinces are going to tell them to fuck off.
But they can say at these meetings, like, look, why don't you learn from each other? Why don't you learn the best practices on this, in this case, from Manitoba and New Brunswick, and share in the different things that you've each been doing to lower the number of people who are going to our emergency rooms?
Yeah, my experience tells me that there's a big gulf between the two parties on this. And that the Liberals, especially when they're in government in Ottawa, do not sufficiently understand the impact of the outcomes, the bad outcomes of the healthcare system. They're too removed from it. It's too remote from the federal government. What's actually happening on the ground that is driving people crazy and giving them anxiety every day. On the other hand, I think the Conservatives consistently fail to appreciate how emotionally attached Canadians are to the principles of our healthcare system, of universal public funding, and are constantly coming up with ideas to chip away at that make people suspicious of them on healthcare. So I don't really think either party speaks effectively on healthcare to voters.
And I would just add 2 quick things to all that you said, Melanie, as well as, like, first of all, there's all sorts of forums for them to share information and best practices that exist, and it still doesn't happen. And it's probably for all the millions of reasons that, complex systems, still find ways to complicate themselves still further. But, and I guess, so fundamentally, you can't get away from the gravitational pull of, funding. Like, there's just I think people say, well, it's got to be more than funding, and that's indisputable, but it is massively about funding. And that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, although your example is well taken, you're making some very sweeping assumptions about what the cause of my urinary tract infection is. And I don't think you should just so smugly assume that it can be cured through antibiotics. All right?
Yours would definitely be complex.
All right, kids. That's been a great show. I've had a blast. It's time for Gordon Pinsent and the Hey Yous.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
Hey, who wants to start, Scott or Melanie?
You go, Melanie.
Sure. Okay. My Hey You is to Raquel Dancho, who is the Conservative MP for Kildonan, St. Paul, and Manitoba. And she's about to spend the rest of her summer leading the Public Safety Committee investigation into Bill Blair's potential interference into the handling of the Nova Scotia mass killing investigation. The hearings start at the end of July. She is, like I said, the Conservative public safety critic. She's fluently bilingual. She's a rising star, whip smart, incredibly poised. We saw how the We Charity and the SNC scandals basically made Pierre Poilievre. He built his entire career off of that, of those successes. This will do that for Raquel, but she's a very different breed. She is, as the kids say, classy AF. She will cut you down to size and leave you saying thank you. In the words of Little Big Town, and I know we have some country music fans here, I've got a girl crush. So that's my Hey You.
Excellent. Well, that
Awesome.
will be interesting hearing for sure. Scott.
Mine is a slightly different tone. My Hey You goes out to Patrick Brown because we have been away for a week and we missed all the big kerfuffle last week. I just want to go on the record and say to Patrick Brown as directly as I can, go the fuck away. Just go away. Don't run for mayor of Brampton. I know you will, right? Don't petition and try to appeal as though like you have a legal foothold and that the administrative processes that govern the Conservative Party of Canada are going to give you some sort of legal opportunity. Just go away. Just go away, okay? Like you are what people who sit around and complain about politics think about politics. Go away. We don't need you in politics. And finally, and most concerning of all, the stench of you actually obscures, right, what I think we ought to be focused on, which is Pierre Poilievre and the threat that he fundamentally represents. But you make him look good. Go away. Fuck off. Go away. We don't need you, Patrick Brown.
He's not going anywhere out of politics. He'd have to sell cars for a living.
No one ever dies in politics.
What else would he do? What's his skill set good for?
I think he's technically a lawyer, ironically.
So am I. My Hey You goes out to Minister Jean-Yves Duclos, the federal health minister, and it is, listen, if we're setting up for a fight with the provinces over a system vision versus just blank checks being sent to the provinces, then I think the feds need to have a clearer vision of what that system is and to express that vision more clearly. It may be time for an update of the Canada Health Act. There's been so much talk about the role mental health plays. The government's talking about introducing dental. There were some rumors about pharma. Where is this system going? Where do the feds want it to go? What do they want it to do? Let's hear a national vision for healthcare from the Trudeau government, and that would be your job, Jean-Yves Duclos. So that's my Hey You for the week. That's our show for the week. Melanie, thank you for joining us. So much fun.
Thank you for having me and not making me go sit in a spa with you.
I'll never make you do that. I think it's against the law.
Should be.
Scott, great to see you again after a couple of weeks. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, the whole Air Quotes Media Group for helping to put this on, and obviously all of you Hurly-Burleyites for listening or watching. Thanks, and sorry about last week, and we'll see you next week. Take care.